You may have likely heard during the 1800s, several prominent Bible commentators, preachers, and writers sought to give a double and broader prophetic meaning to the 7 times that passed over King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon by force of what had been foretold in his dream of a huge chopped down tree, according to the account of Daniel chapter 4, verses 4, 5, 10 through 17. The 7 times were then calculated as a prophetic period of 2,520 days, or 20 years, at the end of which Jesus Christ would come as king and take over the rulership of the world. This argument was based on the understanding that each of those 7 times in Nebuchadnezzar's dream was made up of 360 days, which multiplied by 7 would amount to 2,520 days. Those who attach a greater prophetic meaning to those 7 times allege that the 2,520 days should actually mean years, based on their interpretation of Numbers 14, verses 33 and 34, and Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, where the scriptures say, a day for a year, meaning that a day would be equivalent to a year. Nevertheless, a natural and contextualized reading of those passages does not provide any basis to assert that God was thereby setting a strict rule that would have to be applied whenever the Bible spoke of other days or times in prophecy. As you may have further heard, those 19th century Bible commentators put forth different starting and ending dates for the 2,520 years. This is how the years 1793, 1843, 1844, 1914, 1915, and 1917 became propounded dates for the return of Christ and the beginning of God's kingdom on earth. However, the evidence around us clearly demonstrates that Jesus Christ did not return in any of those years, whereupon the kingdom of God has not yet begun its rule over the world. Why did those predictions fail? Because the ones who made them did not stick to what the Bible says, preferring to go beyond the things that are written, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. They were mostly guided by their own subjectivities and unfounded speculations. The scriptures, though, remind us that when someone's word is not fulfilled or does not come true, then Jehovah did not speak that word, according to Deuteronomy 18, verse 22. Therefore, we can say with absolute confidence that not even one of those calculations and interpretations proceeded from Jehovah. They are all false. That includes the teaching that the times of the Gentiles or the times of the nations, depending on the Bible version, lasted 2,520 years. But Is it not true that the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and its 7 times have a much greater prophetic meaning than what transpired in the personal experience of that Babylonian king? No, it is not. Actually, it was the pegging of a greater prophetic significance into Nebuchadnezzar's dream that became the fundamental reason behind the failure of all those calculations and predictions. Hence, it is necessary to dismiss the thesis that the 7 times of Nebuchadnezzar's dream had a duration of 2,520 years, and that they stood for the appointed times of the nations or the Gentile times mentioned by Jesus at Luke 21, verse 24. If we read the 37 verses of the 4th chapter of Daniel, we will not find a single indication that Nebuchadnezzar's dream would also have a greater fulfillment than what really befell that monarch. The prophet Daniel, who was called in before the king, gave him the full interpretation of the dream according to what had been revealed to him by Jehovah. And this is the only divine interpretation that Daniel verbalized to the king, as we read from Daniel chapter 4, verses 20 through 37. The tree that you saw that grew great and became strong, whose top reached the heavens and was visible to all the earth, which had beautiful foliage, abundant fruit, and food for all, beneath which the beasts of the field would dwell, and on whose branches the birds of the heavens would reside. It is you, O king, because you have grown great and become strong, and your grandeur has grown and reached to the heavens, and your rulership to the ends of the earth. And the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from the heavens, who was saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground, with the bending of iron and of copper among the grass of the field. And let the dew of the heavens make it wet, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field until 7 times pass over it. This is the interpretation, O king. It is the decree of the Most High that must befall my lord the king. You will be driven away from among men, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field, and you will be given vegetation to eat just like bulls, and you will become wet with the dew of the heavens, and 7 times will pass over you, until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that he grants it to whomever he wants. But because they said to leave the stump of the tree with its roots, your kingdom will be yours again after you come to know that the heavens are ruling. Therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. Turn away from your sins by doing what is right, and from your iniquity by showing mercy to the poor. It may be that your prosperity will be extended. All of this befell King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king was saying, is this not Babylon the Great, that I myself have built for the royal house by my own strength and might, and for the glory of my majesty? While the word was yet in the king's mouth, a voice came down from the heavens. To you it is being said, O King Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom has gone away from you, and from mankind you are being driven away. With the beasts of the field your dwelling will be, and you will be given vegetation to eat just like bulls, in 7 times will pass over you, until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that he grants it to whomever he wants. At that moment, the word was fulfilled on Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from mankind, and he began to eat vegetation just like bulls. And his body became wet with the dew of the heavens, and his hair grew long just like eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to the heavens, and my understanding returned to me. And I praised the Most High, and to the one living forever I gave praise and glory, because his rulership is an everlasting rulership, and his kingdom is for generation after generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are regarded as nothing, and he does according to his own will among the army of the heavens and the inhabitants of the earth. And there is no one who can hinder him or say to him, "What have you done?" At that time my understanding returned to me, and the glory of my kingdom, my majesty, and my splendor returned to me. My high officials and nobles eagerly sought me out, and I was restored to my kingdom, and even more greatness was added to me. Now, I, Nebuchadnezzar, am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of the heavens, because all his works are truth, and his ways are just, and because he is able to humiliate those who are walking in pride. From the inspired passage just read, we notice with much clarity that Nebuchadnezzar's dream had just one God-provided interpretation, not 2 or more. Any other interpretation must then be ruled out. Daniel did not tell the king, "This is one of the interpretations of your dream," but "This is the interpretation, O king. It is the decree of the Most High that must befall my lord the king." Nobody has the right to add anything to that divine interpretation. It would be presumptuous on our part to go beyond the things that are written according to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. The dream and its 7 times were entirely fulfilled on Nebuchadnezzar. He learned the lesson that God gave him. When Nebuchadnezzar humbly recognized that the Most High is the universal sovereign and therefore is the supreme ruler in the kingdom of mankind, Jehovah kindly allowed him to be restored to his kingdom and his throne. While Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the huge chopped down tree and the 7 times had its entire fulfillment in that king's own personal experience, a previous dream that he had had of a large statue made of gold, silver, copper, iron, and clay was supposed to have a much broader fulfillment, which would extend into our own time and culminate in the near future. That prospect was clearly presented to Nebuchadnezzar when the prophet told him on the occasion, "But there is a God in the heavens who is a revealer of secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what is to happen in the final part of the days. This is your dream, and these are the visions of your head as you lay on your bed. As for you, O king, on your bed, your thoughts turn to what is to take place in the future. And the revealer of secrets has made known to you what is to happen," according to Daniel 2, verses 28 and 29. After describing the dream that had been temporarily forgotten by Nebuchadnezzar and bringing it back to the king's recollection, Daniel went on to tell him, This is the dream. And we will now tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the might, the strength, and the glory, and into whose hands he has given men wherever they may dwell, as well as the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens, in whom he has made ruler over all of them. You yourself are the head of gold. But after you, another kingdom will rise inferior to you. Then another kingdom, a third one, of copper, that will rule over the whole earth. As for the fourth kingdom, it will be strong like iron. For just as iron crushes and pulverizes everything else, yes, like iron that shatters, it will crush and shatter all of these. And just as you saw the feet and the toes to be partly of clay of a potter and partly of iron, the kingdom will be divided, but some of the hardness of iron will be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom will be partly strong and partly fragile. Just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay, they will be mixed with the people, but they will not stick together one to the other, just as iron does not mix with clay. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And this kingdom will not be passed on to any other people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it alone will stand forever, just as you saw that out of the mountain a stone was cut not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the copper, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy, according to Daniel 2, verses 36 through 45. The passage just read, based on King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, talks about successive world powers that would rise up after the demise of the Babylonian Empire. For their part, those world powers would eventually be overturned and crushed out of existence by God's kingdom, which was represented by a stone that became a large mountain to the point of filling the whole earth, according to Daniel 2, verses 34 and 35. The scriptures thus leave no doubt that the fulfillment of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the large statue would not be restricted to that king's own personal experience, but would far transcend it. The same, though, does not apply to the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of the huge tree in the 7 times, due to the limited scope of its fulfillment. We should also bear in mind that whenever the scriptures intend a far-reaching fulfillment for a dream or a vision, they do not leave us in the dark. According to Daniel 7, verses 15 through 18, in verse 27, in chapter 8, verses 15 through 17, in verses 20 and 21. It was in the context of Jerusalem's predicted destruction at the hands of the Romans in 70 CE that Jesus made a fleeting reference to the appointed times of the nations. The gospel writer Luke quotes Jesus as saying, "And they, that is, the Jews, will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled." Luke 21, verse 24. As we may still recall, the Jewish historian Josephus calculated the number of those who fell by the edge of the sword at 1,100,000, while those who were sold out as slaves and dispersed among the nations amounted to 97,000. He further wrote that except for 3 towers and much of the city wall on its west side that were ordered by Titus to be left standing, everything else in Jerusalem was completely razed to the ground, making it hard for someone to believe that it had ever been inhabited. For decades thereafter, the site where Jerusalem once existed was just a desolate series of debris and mounds of rubble. Historians say that in 130 CE, the then Roman Emperor Hadrian, while on a visit to the region, vowed to build a new city on the ruins of the Jewish city that Titus had destroyed some 60 years prior. The new city was to be called Aelia Capitolina and would be designed after other Roman cities with pagan temples, including a majestic one dedicated to Jupiter, Capitolinus, which would be put up on the site where the Jews' temple once stood. This plan triggered another Jewish revolt in 132 CE under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, believed by many Jews of those days to be the promised Messiah. The rebellion was finally quashed by the end of 135 CE, with hundreds of thousands of Jews having lost their lives. Hadrian expelled all the Jews from the region, and the province of Judea was renamed Syria, Palestina, in a move to cut off the connection between the Jews in that land. Hadrian then brought in Roman citizens and other non-Jews to populate Aelia Capitolina, and thenceforward, that was the name by which the rebuilt city of Jerusalem was called. In subsequent periods of its history, the city of Jerusalem came to be under the control of successive empires and caliphates. In our day, the government of the State of Israel considers the whole city of Jerusalem as its capital, even though such claim is amply rejected by the international community, which views the east side of Jerusalem as part of the Palestinian territory. Hence, the site where the ancient city of Jerusalem was located has indeed been ruled and literally trampled on by the nations for a very long time. But when did the nations really begin to trample Jerusalem underfoot? The Romans, as a foreign occupying power, had already been treading Jerusalem underfoot for more than a century when it was destroyed by Titus in 70 CE. So the trampling that Jesus referred to did not start in that year. As a matter of fact, prior to the arrival of the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, and the Babylonians had successively occupied Jerusalem and trampled it with their invading armies. When Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar toppled Zedekiah, the last king in David's lineage, and destroyed Jerusalem and its temple for the first time, the city began effectively to be trampled on by the nations. However, the Babylonians' trampling of Jerusalem involved more than the mere stomping march of Nebuchadnezzar's armies on the scorched ruins of that city. Where else was involved? And what would happen when the trampling that started in Nebuchadnezzar's day got to a screeching halt at the end of the appointed times of the nations? Before we answer these questions, let us take a moment to review a promise that Jehovah made to King David through his prophet Nathan. At that time, David was already reigning over the entire nation of Israel from the city of Jerusalem, which he had taken from the Jebusites. Jehovah then told Nathan, "Now say this to my servant David. This is what Jehovah of armies says. I took you from the pastures, from following the flock, to become a leader over my people Israel. And I will be with you wherever you go, and I will do away with all your enemies from before you. And I will make a great name for you, like the name of the great men of the earth. When your days come to an end and you are laid to rest with your forefathers, then I will raise up your offspring after you, your own son, and I will firmly establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will firmly establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Your house and your kingdom will be secure forever before you. Your throne will be firmly established forever." 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8, 9, 12, 13, and 16. Jehovah's promise to perpetuate the kingdom of David in his lineage was further reinforced in the book of Psalms. There Jehovah is quoted as saying, "I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David my servant, I will firmly establish your offspring forever, and I will build up your throne for all generations. I have found David my servant, with my holy oil I have anointed him, and I will place him as firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. I will maintain my loyal love for him forever, and my covenant with him will never fail. I will establish his offspring forever and make his throne as enduring as the heavens. I will not violate my covenant or change what my lips have spoken. I have sworn in my holiness once and for all. I will not tell lies to David. His offspring will endure forever. His throne will endure like the sun before me, like the moon. It will be firmly established forever as a faithful witness in the skies." Psalm 89, verses 3, 4, 20, 27 through 29, and 34 through 37. Shortly before his death, David congregated all the princes of Israel to Jerusalem, along with all the military chiefs and his court officials. Then he told them, "Jehovah, the God of Israel, chose me out of all the house of my father to become king over Israel forever. For he chose the tribe of Judah as leader, and of the house of Judah, my father's house, and of my father's sons, I was the one whom he approved to make me king over all Israel. And of my sons, for Jehovah has given me many sons, he chose my son, Solomon, to sit on the throne of the kingship of Jehovah over Israel," according to 1 Chronicles 28, verses 1, 4, and 5. After that, Solomon sat on Jehovah's throne as king in place of David his father, and he was successful, and all the Israelites were obedient to him. And Jehovah made Solomon exceedingly great before the eyes of all Israel, and bestowed on him royal majesty such as no king over Israel ever had before, according to 1 Chronicles 29, verses 23 and 25. From then on, every king in the lineage of David who reigned in Jerusalem was figuratively sitting on the throne of the kingship of Jehovah over Israel. For God was the supreme ruler of that nation. The Israelites lived under a true theocratic government. The kings in Jerusalem acted merely as visible representatives of Jehovah to whom their kingdom rightfully belonged, according to 1 Chronicles 29, verses 10 and 11. A few hundred years later, due to the extreme badness of the nation's ways before Jehovah, he allowed the Babylonian Empire to overthrow the kingdom of Zedekiah and to destroy Jerusalem and its Solomon-built temple. Through his prophet Ezekiel, Jehovah addressed King Zedekiah in these words: "This is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah says: remove the turban and take off the crown. This will not remain the same. Raise up the low one and bring the high one. A ruin, I will make it, and it will not belong to anyone until the one who has the legal right comes, and I will give it to him," according to Ezekiel 21, verses 26 and 27. By Jehovah's sovereign order, the crown was figuratively removed from King Zedekiah's head when Nebuchadnezzar dethroned him and exiled him to Babylon, where he died, according to the accounts of Jeremiah 52, verses 8 through 11, Ezekiel 17, verse 16, and 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 5 through 7. The situation had completely changed for the kingdom of Judah, and by extension for the whole nation of Israel, that for long had enjoyed the lofty privilege of being ruled by Jehovah through his visible representatives in the royal lineage of King David. Jehovah had long promised the nation of Israel that if it obeyed him as it should, he would put it high above all other nations of the earth. He told it further: Jehovah will make you the head and not the tail, and you will be on top and not on the bottom, if you keep obeying the commandments of Jehovah your God that I am commanding you today to observe and to do. Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 and 13. Now, the overturned kingdom of Judah and its inhabitants, who were also rooted out of their land and taken into captivity in Babylon, had been brought shamefully down into subjection to foreign, tyrant-ruled empires. The Israelites were no longer on top, but on the bottom. They had been stripped of the privilege and the dignified condition of being a nation ruled by Jehovah, the visible representation of God's kingship over Israel, had regrettably fallen to Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar, who now trampled it underfoot with his armies. Nevertheless, the removal of the crown from King Zedekiah's head did not absolutely mean that Jehovah would put it on Nebuchadnezzar's head. This Babylonian king was not qualified to wear it. He was neither a worshiper of Jehovah nor a member of King David's offspring, with whom Jehovah had made a covenant for an everlasting kingship. Nebuchadnezzar was only an instrument that Jehovah used to inflict punishment on the kingdom of Judah and on other nations due to their extreme wickedness and lack of genuine repentance, according to Jeremiah 25, verse 8 through 11, chapter 27, verses 6 through 8, and chapter 28, verse 14. Zedekiah's crown as a symbol of God-given royal authority would not belong to anyone until the coming of the one who has the legal right, to whom Jehovah would permanently give it. However, that legal right would not depend exclusively upon someone's being a direct descendant of King David. Had it been the case, hundreds of individuals in David's lineage could have stepped forward to claim that right. Therefore, it is Jehovah God, the supreme ruler, who has the ultimate authority to select the one to whom the crown should be given. Do the scriptures reveal who was the one that Jehovah selected among David's fleshly offspring to receive the crown? Yes, they do. We find that revelation in the gospel account of Luke. There we read, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin promised in marriage to a man named Joseph of David's house, and the name of the virgin was Mary. So the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And look, you will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and you are to name him Jesus. This one will be great and will be called Son of the Most High, and Jehovah God will give him the throne of David his father, and he will rule as king over the house of Jacob forever, and there will be no end to his kingdom." Luke chapter 1, verses 26, 27, in verses 30 through 33. Thus, the sacred secret regarding the identity of the one who would have the legal right to the kingdom and the crown that had been taken off from Zedekiah's head was finally revealed. Through his angel, Jehovah communicated to Mary the selection that he had made of the one to whom he would give the throne of David, so that he could rule as king forever, with no end to his kingdom. Jehovah even gave a name to his chosen king, Jesus. But would Jesus exercise his everlasting authority as king only over the fleshly descendants of Jacob, namely Israel? It is certainly true that the kings of Israel who sat on Jehovah's throne in Jerusalem ruled only over those who lived in their territory, the bounds of which had been clearly demarcated by Jehovah according to Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21, Exodus 23, verse 31, Numbers 34, verses 1 through 12, in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 21. Before the Israelites took possession of the land that Jehovah had given them, they were ordered to destroy 7 wicked nations that lived therein, according to Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 through 6, and chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. But later, the nation of Israel was explicitly forbidden from nurturing imperialistic ambitions or engaging in any kind of expansionist adventure beyond her God-fixed borders. The Israelites and their kings had to respect the partition of territories that Jehovah had assigned to the different nations that shared borders with them, according to Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 2 through 5, in verses 9 and 19. The scriptures therefore provide no basis to believe that the kings in Israel had a divine commission to intervene in the affairs of other nations or cause the overthrow of their pagan governments in order to replace them with theocratic ones. Jehovah never gave them such authority. But would he give it to Jesus? This question will be answered further ahead. King David wrote under inspiration, "As for the heavens, they belong to Jehovah, but the earth he has given to the sons of men." Psalm 115, verse 16. The Apostle Paul also added, "And God made out of one man every nation of men to dwell on the entire surface of the earth, and he decreed the appointed times in the set limits of where men would dwell," according to Acts 17, verse 26. It is worth noting that even after the global flood of Noah's day, when mankind was already imperfect, God still stuck to his original purpose of having this planet filled with humans living under his rulership. According to Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 17, and chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. The Bible tells us Noah's sons who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These three were Noah's sons, and all the earth's population came from them and spread abroad, according to Genesis chapter 9, verses 18-19. The 10th chapter of Genesis contains the list of the nations that descended from those three patriarchs, according to Genesis chapter 10, verses 1 through 31. Then in verse 32, the account tells us, "These were the families of the sons of Noah according to their family lines and by their nations. From these the nations were spread abroad in the earth after the flood." However, the scriptures reveal that before the descendants of Noah's sons spread abroad, they defiantly resisted Jehovah's order to disperse and fill the earth. Having first settled themselves as one people with one language in the land of Shinar, in the Furrow Valley plain watered by the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, they decided to build a city to accommodate all of them, plus a high tower so that they could stick together and not be scattered over the entire face of the earth. Jehovah, though, thwarted their plans by confusing their language and gradually forcing them to leave off building the city and move on in separate bands to other parts of the world, according to Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. As countless descendants of Noah's sons began to move out of Shinar into other territories where they eventually settled, a certain Hamite decided not only to remain in Shinar, but also to act in more flagrant opposition to Jehovah's orders. The Bible tells us, "The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Cush became father to Nimrod. He was the first to become a mighty one on the earth. He became a mighty hunter in opposition to Jehovah. That is why there is a saying, just like Nimrod, a mighty hunter in opposition to Jehovah. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. This is the great city, according to Genesis 10, verse 6, and 8 through 12 in 1 Chronicles 1, verses 8 and 10. Nimrod was Noah's great-grandson, and according to what the scriptures just read clearly reveal, he became the first man ever to rise above others as king. He was the founder of the first kingdom that ever existed on this planet. This fact makes him the patron of all politicians and the one who devised the oldest system of political government, a kingdom. Nimrod must have initially distinguished himself as a brave hunter of wild beasts that roam Mesopotamia, likely terrifying those who lived there. His hunting prowess, coupled with his brazen opposition to Jehovah's authority, somehow won him the admiration of the local population, who shortly thereafter began to serve him as subjects of his kingdom. Afterwards, Nimrod became a tyrannical hunter of humans whom he exploited not only for his kingdom in city building projects, but also for his aggressive military campaigns. When the Bible says at Genesis 10 verse 9 that Nimrod acted in opposition to Jehovah, according to the New World Translation, or in defiance of the Lord, according to the International Standard Version, the literal translation of the expression in Hebrew is in the face of Jehovah, in front of Jehovah, or before Jehovah. In Hebrew, the word used for these renderings is lifna. But the word lifna, as used in the context of this scripture and others, denotes not a submissive frame of mind, but a defiant, hostile posture towards someone. The same sense is conveyed in other texts where the word lifna is used, such as Numbers 16 verse 2, Joshua 7 verses 12 and 13, 1 Chronicles 14 verse 8, Job 1 verse 11, and chapter 2 verse 5. Nimrod's actions clearly provoked Jehovah to his face and constituted a defiant assault on God's exclusive right to rule the nations whose existence they owed to him as their creator, according to Revelation 4 verse 11. Nimrod, who certainly took pride in his defiant opposition to Jehovah's sovereignty, must have also completed the construction of Babel or Babylon, which had been interrupted during the confusion of the builders' language, and probably was the one who further built Erech, Akkad, in Calneh, in southern Mesopotamia, in today's Iraq. For some time, that was the territory of his kingdom. But driven by his insatiable thirst for more power, territory, and subjects to rule over, Nimrod decided to extend the tentacles of his royal dominion into northern Mesopotamia, the area which later would become known as Assyria. There, some 300 miles or 480 kilometers north of Babylon, Nimrod built a large metropolis comprised of Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Resen. Thus, more than 1,200 years later, the prophetic reference made by the prophet Micah to the land of Assyria is still evoked memories of a time when it used to be called the land of Nimrod, according to Micah 5 verse 6. After Nimrod established his kingdom in opposition to Jehovah's rulership, it did not take long for other descendants of Noah's sons to follow his bad example and constitute kings over themselves, thereby giving birth to the city-states, nations, kingdoms, and empires of antiquity. But just as Jehovah had not hindered Nimrod from establishing a kingdom in Mesopotamia, he did not bar those individuals either from setting up kingdoms and empires of different sizes elsewhere. Does this mean that Jehovah was relinquishing his sovereign authority over the nations and giving them unrestricted permission to govern themselves in perpetuity? No, it does not. Jehovah, as the supreme ruler of the universe and of humankind, having full control of the situation, decreed the appointed times and the set limits of where men would dwell, according to Acts 17, verse 26. This means that Jehovah sovereignly determined not only the physical environment where man could live, but also the very length of the times during which their nations would be allowed to rule themselves apart from him. Many Bible expositors have taught for decades that the appointed times of the nations mentioned by Jesus at Luke 21:24 started when Judah's king Zedekiah was dethroned by the Babylonians and his royal city of Jerusalem was razed and trampled on by a succession of foreign powers. According to this interpretation, both the appointed times of the nations and the trampling of Jerusalem and of what it represented started at the same time and on the same date. While it is biblically and historically safe to say that the trampling of Jerusalem by foreign powers started indeed when Nebuchadnezzar's armies invaded and destroyed it, the period known as the appointed times of the nations had actually started some 1,500 years prior to that, when the world's first nation, structured as a kingdom, was established by Nimrod in Mesopotamia. In other words, when Nebuchadnezzar began to trample Jerusalem underfoot, the appointed times of the nations were already in progress for about 15 centuries. Moreover, when the nation of Israel was founded shortly after the Exodus from Egypt, the appointed times of the nations were already taken away for over 500 years. The nations, which at the time of Israel's formation were structured as city-states, sheikdoms, kingdoms, and empires, were already in existence since Nimrod's day, hundreds of years earlier. This historical fact proves that those nations were already living out the appointed times that Jehovah had decreed for them. We must bear in mind that if Jehovah had not granted those unspecified periods of time for the nations to function as organized, self-ruled structures, they simply would not have been able to exist. According to Romans 13 verse 1 and 1 John 19 verses 10 and 11. It is only by Jehovah's permission that the nations exist, despite the fact that they are political structures set up in opposition to him and designed to usurp his legitimate right to rule over his creatures. Therefore, the purpose behind the appointed times of the nations was to make it possible for them to exist and prove that they would be able to rule themselves successfully apart from Jehovah. However, the appointed times of the nations in their later trampling of Jerusalem are separate events that do not begin at the same time. Nimrod carried out the first assault on Jehovah's direct authority over Noah's offspring by establishing a rival political kingdom in Mesopotamia. For his part, Nebuchadnezzar in later years, he started to trample underfoot both the city of Jerusalem and its theocratic kingdom arrangement in the lineage of David. However, the trampling of Jerusalem by the nations was only made possible because they, that is, the nations, had been previously allowed to exist and function during the appointed times that Jehovah had granted them. The scriptures do not reveal the date when Jehovah began to count the appointed times that he fixed for the nations to rule themselves, nor when they will expire. They are times that the Father has placed in his own jurisdiction, according to Acts 1, verse 7. The reason why we do not know when those appointed times began is simple. The Bible does not record the date when Nimrod effectively began to rule as king of the first kingdom in the world. However, what we do know is that since Nimrod's day, the appointed times of the nations have been sufficiently long to prove whether human rule is better than Jehovah's or not. The truth of the matter is that mankind's history has been characterized by political, military, religious, and economical rivalries that quite so often have engulfed the nations in bloody conflicts. Still, there is a common thread that runs through the fabric of every nation. Its opposition to Jehovah God and his ruling authority and worship. Why is it so? Because unbeknownst to the nations and their political rulers, they are all under the invisible power and the influence of Jehovah's archenemy and opposer, Satan the devil, according to Luke chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, John 12, verse 31, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, and 1 John chapter 5, verse 19. Therefore, it is impossible for the nations not to reflect the traits of their wicked, invisible ruler. They love the things that God hates and hate the things that God loves. Hence, they have no disposition whatsoever to submit to God's rulership. What will Jehovah do then when the appointed times that he granted the nations expire? Shortly before his death, the patriarch Jacob pronounced a prophetic blessing upon his fourth son, Judah. This is what Jacob said, among other things. The scepter will not depart from Judah, neither the commander's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him the obedience of the peoples will belong. Genesis 49, verse 10. Who is this Shiloh who would come and exert ruling authority over the peoples or nations? We know for a fact that Shiloh would have to be born into the tribe of Judah, from which the royal authority, represented by the scepter, could never be taken. This means that the tribe of Judah would supply kings in the lineage of David for the nation of Israel until the arrival of Shiloh, to whom the royal scepter of Judah would be permanently passed on. Shiloh would then receive the authority to rule not only over the nation of Israel, but also over the peoples or nations of the world. As we have already seen, the kings in Israel had no permission to exert dominion over other peoples. Why? Because the obedience of the peoples did not belong to them. It belongs to Shiloh. If the peoples of the nations were to owe their obedience to the kings of Israel, there would be no need for the coming of Shiloh. We should bear in mind that when Jacob bestowed his prophetic blessing upon Judah, the nation of Israel had not even been formed. Jacob also indicated that his prophetic blessings, which obviously would include the reference to Shiloh, would be fulfilled in the final part of the days, according to Genesis 49, verse 10. Therefore, the conclusion that we draw from Shiloh's foretold kingly authority is that it will not be limited to the geographical borders of the nation of Israel. Rather, it will encompass the whole world. Who then is Shiloh? The meaning of the very word Shiloh gives us the clue to whom it refers. Shiloh is a Hebrew word which means the one to whom it belongs, or he whose it is. Shiloh thus has the legal right to something, which in this case would be the dominion over the peoples or nations of the world. Who has the legal right to inherit the never-ending kingdom in the lineage of David, according to what was foretold at Ezekiel 21, verses 26 and 27? Jesus Christ. He alone is the promised Shiloh, who descends from the tribe of Judah and has the right to receive the scepter of kingly authority over the nations, according to Hebrews 7, verse 14, Revelation 5, verse 5, Matthew 1, verses 1 and 2, and Luke 3, verses 23, 33. When Jesus Christ receives the royal scepter from Jehovah's hands after the coming great tribulation, the appointed times of the nations will expire, according to Psalm 2, verses 4, 6, 8, 9, chapter 45, verse 6, chapter 110, verses 1, 2, 5, and 6, in Matthew 24, verses 29 and 30. Their governments will all be overturned and replaced by God's kingdom, according to Daniel chapter 2, verse 24 or 44. At that time will be fulfilled the prophetic word that Jehovah God will give Jesus Christ rulership, honor, and the kingdom, that the peoples, nations, and language groups should all serve him. His rulership is an everlasting rulership that will not pass away, and his kingdom will not be destroyed, according to Daniel 7, verse 14, and Psalm 72, verse 11. The time will have then arrived for the world to be ruled by just one government, that of Jehovah God and of his Son, Jesus Christ, according to Revelation 11, verse 15. And even more importantly, that will be the time when Jehovah's sublime name will be sanctified by means of his kingdom, and his sovereign will shall be done on earth as in heaven, according to Matthew 6, verses 9 and 10, in Ezekiel 38, verse 23. How grand that day will be. In the following weeks, we will be publishing more videos with other important biblical themes. Feel free to subscribe to our channel and contact us through our email. Thank you for your kind attention.